everybody, I'm Natalie with Missouri Star Quilt Company, and today in Quilting 101 we're going to talk about squaring up your blocks. So first of all, squaring up just means that you're going to trim your blocks so that they're all the same size. That is something that makes putting them together easier. You can square up units of a block before you make the full block. If all of the pieces that you're putting together are the right sizes and then your seams are consistent, your blocks should turn out to be the size that is recommended in the pattern, but they'll also be flat and they'll be easy to put together in rows, and your life will just be so much easier. So yes, sometimes squaring is a pain, but it is well worth it when you're sewing those pieces together to try and create the block that you're working on. To square, I'm going to start with a half square triangle because they are typically very common in patterns, and that'll be a block that you'll square often. So I can show you with a 10-inch ruler or with your long ruler. The thing that you need to look for on whatever squaring tool you have is a 45-degree angle line, and that's this one right here. That lines up with the seam line on your block, and it helps you to get straight edges all the way around. All right, so with your 10-inch square, you're going to put that line right on the seam, right down the middle. And we're going to square this to, let's say, 4 1/4. So what I'm looking at here, I have these lines down here, and if this part was really wonky, I would scoot it up so that I could flip it around and square that other side. All right, so we're going to kind of center it. We're going to make sure that our 45-degree line lines up with our seam, and then we're going to trim these two sides first. Just like that. And then we're going to flip this around and we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to line it up, but this time, this time I'm going to use this cut edge that I just cut, and I'm going to make that line up exactly on my 4 1/4 line so that it is straight and square. Square is the, that's how you know that it's squared. All right, so then I'm just going to trim these two sides. And that is it. This block is now squared to a perfect 4 1/4 inches. Okay, so if you don't have a square ruler, but you have a long ruler with a 45-degree angle on it, you can still square up your blocks using this ruler. So we are going to take this little guy right here. We're going to line up our 45-degree angle line on the seam line. And this block looks like it could be squared to 3 inches. So that is what I'm going to do. I'm going to make sure that my fabric on the block is inside or larger than the 3 inches that I'm going to cut. So I make sure that I have room on both sides so that I can flip it around and square the other side as well. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and line that up and cut these two sides. Flip that around, making sure the cut sides that I just cut are on the inside of the ruler. This time I'm going to line them up exactly with my 3-inch lines and keep the 45-degree line on that seam line. And then square these pieces or these sides here. And just like that, I've got a beautiful squared 3-inch half square triangle. So half square triangles are pretty easy once you get going. You'll get the hang of it and you'll just fly through them. It's no big deal. But sometimes you have blocks that come out a little wonky. Maybe you've even squared all of the pieces going into it and it's still a little wonky. What you want to do with this block, if you have a pile of them, first of all, you want to measure and find like your average size. So that you square them all to the same size so that when you're putting those blocks together, then that's much easier. But what I would do with that is I would use my cutting mat as my guide. And there's one other thing I want to make sure and point out is on these points here, if you cut in farther than 1/4 inch, that's where you're going to start losing your seam. Because if we're sewing 1/4 inch seams, we want that seam to end right there at that point so that we keep those points. Otherwise, you know, you'll be able to tell that you don't even have enough room to keep that point if you've cut your block down that much. Now, lots of quilts look great with lost points. It's not a big deal, but that's just information for you to keep in mind when you're squaring up these blocks. So for this quilt, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by squaring up an edge that, that needs help. And then I'm going to use that as my line that I line up with the other measurements on the mat. So I am going to just straighten this one out. And I still have a good 1/4 of an inch here. And I'm going to cut just this little wobbly part right here. It'll make sewing it together a lot easier. So just a tiny little bit there. And then this side, I'm going to line up on my mat with the straight line over here. It doesn't, I'm not super worried about what the number is, but I'll use that to get this block nice and straight. And then over on this side, I'm going to do the same thing. Using the lines on the ruler with the lines on your mat is how you can get a nice straight clean cut. And I want to make sure that I have a 1/4 of an inch here. And I don't know if you can see this, but this block comes in a little bit right here. I could pull it in some, but I feel like at this point right here, I'm getting close to losing my 1/4 of an inch. So what I want to tell you is that if pieces of it are not exactly straight, you can work with that as you're sewing along, as long as it's within a 1/4 of an inch. When you get down to the 1/8 and smaller, you run the risk of the fabric pulling apart and your seam having like a popped seam where the fabric kind of pulls out and you have a hole in your quilt. So just be aware of that and be careful of it. If you want to, you could put a piece of like fusible stabilizer to kind of extend the fabric in the seam, and that will help with security so that you could still use it and not have a popped seam. You could do that as a fix. I don't usually, just because if I needed to square this whole thing down, I would just square it down and lose my points and make sure that my quilt is secure, because there's nothing worse than getting a quilt back from the quilter and having a hole in a seam that you missed. That's just so frustrating. So anyways, just a few things to keep in mind. Keep your points and keep it lined up. And then because you have it lined up over here on this side, you're going to trust that these lines are straight and line them up with your ruler as well. And that is how you're going to square this block. So I've got that, and I'm going to go ahead and trim this side right here. And I'm not worrying that this is not quite to the length of the side of this ruler, because I think that will catch in the seam no problem. All right, I'm going to use these 2 straight lines and line them up with the lines on my mat to make sure that this entire block is going to be good and square when I'm done. So I line that up, and now I'm going to be trimming these 2 sides. So I'll do this one first. And it looks like I'm going to have more space in here than I do on this one. So as long as that's within that 1/8 of an inch, I feel okay about it. And it lets me keep my points. So I'm just going to trim off this little bit right here. I'll flip that around. Obviously, if you're left-handed, you're going to do this from the other side. Just a little tip there. You can pull them and wiggle them around till they do what they're supposed to do. All right, I'm going to go ahead and trim this side as well. All right, after squaring all the edges, this block now measures 12.5, and it's nice and square. It looks a little bit better than it did before, and it's going to be a lot easier to sew together in my quilt. I hope this helps when you have the challenge of squaring up blocks, and remember, it's hip to be square.